Friday. My name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the Research Director here at Chatham House for International Security, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Jeremy Corbyn. I'm sure he needs absolutely no introduction to this audience. Jeremy, as you know, was first elected to the House of Commons in 1983. Previously, he was a local councillor and a trade union organiser. In 2015, he was elected leader of the Labour Party on what some might consider a radical platform of increasing wages and rights for workers, full commitment to a public national health service, free at the point of use, and of course, what we're here to talk about today, an international policy with a strong human rights focus. And indeed, today that's what we will be talking about. And I'm sure many of you have other questions that you want to ask on domestic, but if you do, I'm going to, as chair, say please don't ask them. And if you do ask them, I'm going to suggest to Jeremy that he doesn't need to answer them.
It's a deal.
It's a deal? So Jeremy's going to speak first of all, and then we'll get into the question and answer session. Just to say that this is on the record. It is being live streamed, so welcome the rest of the world. Great to have you with us. And for Twitter, for those of you who want to tweet and want to follow, it is hashtag #CHCorbyn. So that's hashtag CH stands for Chatham House, of course, CHCorbyn. So Jeremy, we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Patricia. Patricia, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much to Chatham House for inviting me here today. This is actually a sad day for Chatham House. The director, Dr. Robin Liblet, can't be here because he's attending the funeral of Michael Williams, Lord Williams of Baglan, who's recently died of a terrible cancer. He was Robin Cook's special envoy, advisor, and later special envoy at the United Nations. And Robin Cook was a great friend of mine, and he relied very heavily on Michael Williams for support and advice. And I just think we should commemorate that today and understand why our director can't be here, but also send our sympathies to the families, the family of Michael on their loss. I'd also like to welcome my colleagues from the Shadow Cabinet. Emily Thornbury, our Shadow Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much for coming today, Emily. Hot-footed back from Scotland from Question Time. Thank you. Shami Chakrabarti, our Shadow Attorney General, who's here on the front row, who brings a brilliant legal mind to our team. And Kate Osamore, our Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, who gives us an understanding and a brilliant passion about the need to deal with conflict at source by ensuring people all are able to lead decent, good and sustainable lives. And I thank my colleagues for all that they do and support they give. And as I said, I want to thank Chatham House because it's been at the forefront of thinking on Britain's role in the world. And clearly today, Chatham House rules don't apply because apparently this is being live streamed everywhere. And so with the general election less than a month away, it's a good opportunity to set out my approach on how a Labour government that I lead would keep Britain safe, because that is the primary function of government, reshape our relationships with partners around the world, and crucially, work to strengthen the United Nations and to respond to the global challenges that we all face in the 21st century. And I would like to say a very warm welcome to the UN Special Representative from Somalia, who's here today. Where are you sitting? Thank you very much. Thank you for coming along. And your colleague, your advisor, my great friend Nuruddin Diri, thank you so much for being here today. It's wonderful to see you both. And anybody else I haven't referenced who I know, consider yourselves welcomed, okay? On Monday, we commemorated Victory in Europe Day, the anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in Europe. VE Day marked the defeat of fascism and the beginning of the end of a global war that had claimed 70 million lives. Just think of that figure, 70 million lives were lost in the Second World War. General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in 1944, who was based right here in this square preparing the plan for that invasion of Operation Overlord, later went on to become the Republican President of the United States during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War in the 1950s. His final televised address to the American people as president was fascinating, and he gave a very stark warning of what he described as the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. And he went on to say, only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machine of defence with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Sadly, it's more than 70 years since he made that speech. Sadly, in more than half a century, I think it's clear that Eisenhower's warning has not been heeded. Too much of our debate about defence and security is one-dimensional. You're either for or against what is presented as strong defence, regardless of the actual record of what it has meant in practice. Alert citizens or political leaders who advocate other routes to security are often dismissed or treated as unreliable. My own political views were shaped by my parents' description of the horrors of war and the threat of nuclear holocaust. Indeed, my parents met whilst organising solidarity with the elected government of Spain against Franco's fascists during the Spanish Civil War, which were, of course, supported by Hitler and the Nazis. My generation grew up under the shadow of the Cold War. Our black and white television throughout the 50s and 60s and into the 70s was dominated by Vietnam. As a young person, I was haunted by images of civilians fleeing chemical weapons used by the United States. I didn't imagine that nearly 50 years later, we would still see chemical weapons being used against innocent civilians. What an abject failure. Indeed, I met recently a Vietnam War veteran who had been involved in using Agent Orange and is still traumatized by that experience. How is it that history keeps repeating itself? At the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall came down, we were told it was the end of history. Global leaders promised a more peaceful, stable world. It didn't quite work out like that. Today, the world is more unstable than even at the height of the Cold War. The approach to international security we've been using since the 1990s simply has not worked. Regime change wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Western interventions in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen haven't always succeeded in their own terms. Sometimes they've made the world a more dangerous place. This is the fourth general election in a row to be held while Britain is at war and our armed forces are in action in the Middle East and beyond. The fact is that the war on terror which has driven these interventions, has not succeeded. It has not increased our security at home. In fact, many would say just the opposite. It's caused destabilisation and devastation abroad. And last September, the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee published a report on the Libyan war, which David Cameron, as Prime Minister, promoted our intervention in. They concluded the intervention led to political and economic collapse, humanitarian and migrant crises, and fueled the rise of ISIS in Africa and across the Middle East. Is that really the way to deliver security for our people, the people in Britain? Who seriously believes that's what real strength looks like? We need to step back and have, I think, some fresh thinking. The world faces huge problems. As well as the legacy of regime change wars, there is a dangerous cocktail of ethnic conflicts, food insecurity, water scarcity, and fast emerging effects of climate change. And to that mix, add a grotesque and growing level of inequality in which just 8 billionaires own the same wealth as 3.6 billion of the poorest people on our planet. And you end up with a refugee crisis of epic proportions, affecting every continent in the world, with more displaced people in the world than since the Second World War. Indeed, there are some estimates that think there are more displaced people now than at any time in recorded history. These problems are getting worse, and they are fueling threats and instability. The global situation is becoming more dangerous. And the new United States president seems sadly determined to add to the dangers by recklessly escalating the confrontation with North Korea, unilaterally launching missile strikes on Syria, and opposing what was a great achievement as President Obama's nuclear arms deal with Iran, and the suggestion he's backing a new nuclear arms race. A Labour government will want a strong and friendly relationship with the United States, but we will not be afraid to speak our mind. The United States is the strongest military power on the planet by a very long way. It has a special responsibility to use its power with care and to support international efforts to resolve conflicts collectively and peacefully. Waiting to see which way the wind blows in Washington isn't strong leadership, and pandering to an erratic administration will not deliver stability. So when Theresa May addressed the Republican Party conference in Philadelphia in January, she spoke in alarmist terms about the rise of China and India and the danger of the West being eclipsed. She said America and Britain had to stand together and use their military might to protect their interests. That's the sort of language that led us into the calamities in Iraq and Libya and other disastrous wars, that stole the post-Cold War promise of a new and peaceful world order. I do not see India and China in those terms. Nor do I think do the vast majority of Americans or British people want the boots of their young men and women on the ground in Syria fighting a war that could escalate the suffering and slaughter even further. Britain deserves better than simply outsourcing our country's security and prosperity to the whims of the Trump White House. So no more hand-holding with Donald Trump. A Labour government will conduct a robust and independent foreign policy made in Britain. A Labour government would seek to work for peace and security with all the other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the United States, China, Russia, and France. And with other countries play a major role, such as India, South Africa, Brazil, and Germany. We have to reach out and work with others. The philosophy of bomb first, talk later approach to security has failed. To persist with it, as the Conservative government has made clear it's determined to do, is a recipe for increasing, not reducing, threats and security. I'm often asked if Prime Minister I would order the use of nuclear weapons. It's an extraordinary question when you think about it. Would you order the indiscriminate killing of millions of people? Would you risk such contamination of the planet that no life could exist across large parts of the world? If circumstances arose where there was a real option, it would represent a complete and cataclysmic failure. It would mean world leaders had already triggered a spiral of catastrophe for humankind. Labour is committed to actively pursue disarmament under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we're committed to no first use of nuclear weapons. But let me make this absolutely clear. If elected Prime Minister, I would do everything to protect the security and safety of our people and our country. That is our first duty. And to achieve it, I know, would have to work with other countries to solve problems, diffuse tensions, and build collective security. The best defence is, for Britain, is a government actively engaged in seeking political solutions to the world's problems. It doesn't make me a pacifist. I accept that military action under international law as a genuine last resort is in some circumstances necessary. But that is very far from the kind of unilateral wars and interventions that have become almost routine in recent times. I'll not take lectures on security or humanitarian action from a Conservative Party that stood by in the 1980s, refusing even to impose sanctions while children on the streets of Soweto were being shot down, or which has backed every move our armed forces have put in harm's way, regardless of the impact on our people's security. Once again, in this election, it's become clear that a vote for the Conservatives would be a vote to escalate the war in Syria, risking military confrontation with Russia, adding to the suffering of the Syrian people and increasing global insecurity. When you see children suffering in war, it's only natural to want to do something. But the last thing we need is more of the same failed recipe that served us so badly and the people of the region so calamitously. Labour will stand up for the people of Syria. We will press for war crimes to be properly investigated and work tirelessly to make the Geneva talks work. Every action that is taken over Syria must be judged by whether it helps to bring an end to the tragedy, the appalling tragedy of the Syrian war, or does the opposite. Even if ISIS is defeated militarily, the conflict will not end until there is a negotiated settlement involving all the main parties, including the regional and international powers, and an inclusive government in Iraq. All wars and conflicts eventually are brought to an end by political means. So Labour would adopt a new approach. We'll not step back from our responsibilities, but our focus will be on strengthening international cooperation and supporting the efforts of the United Nations to resolve conflicts. A Labour government will respect international law and oppose lawlessness and unilateralism in international relations. We believe passionately human rights and justice should drive our foreign policy. In the 1960s, Harold Wilson's Labour government worked for and signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As Prime Minister, I hope to build on that achievement. Labour's support for the renewal of the Trident system doesn't preclude from working for meaningful multilateral steps to achieve reductions in nuclear arsenals. A Labour government will pursue a triple commitment to the interlocking foreign policy instruments of defence, development and diplomacy. For all their bluster, the Tory record in defence and security has been one, frankly, of incompetence and failure. They've balanced the books on the backs of servicemen and women. Deep cuts have been made in the army, reduced to its smallest size since the Napoleonic Wars, stagnant pay, worsening conditions, poor housing. The morale of our service personnel and veterans is at rock bottom. And as the security threats and challenges we face are not bound by geographical borders, it's vital that as Britain leaves the European Union, we maintain a close relationship with our European partners alongside NATO to keep spending at 2%, but that means working with our allies to ensure peace and security in Europe. We will work to halt the drift towards confrontation with Russia and the escalation of military deployments across the continent. There's no need whatsoever to weaken our very strong opposition to Russia's human rights abuses at home or abroad, but to understand the necessity of winding down tensions on the Russia-NATO border and supporting dialogue to reduce the risk of international conflict. We'll back a new conference on security and cooperation in Europe and seek to defuse the crisis in the Ukraine through implementation of the Minsk agreements. We'll continue to work with the European Union on operational missions to promote and support global and regional security. This means our armed forces will have the necessary capabilities to fulfill the full range of obligations, ensuring they're versatile and able to participate. Rapid stabilisation, disaster relief, UN peacekeeping and conflict resolution activities. Because security is not only about direct military defence, it's about conflict resolution and preventions, underpinned by strong diplomacy. So the next Labour government will invest in our diplomatic network and consular services. We will seek to rebuild some of the key capabilities and services that have been lost as a result of Conservative cuts in recent years, such as the loss of human rights advisors in so many of our embassies around the world. And finally, while Theresa May seeks to build a coalition of risk and insecurity with Donald Trump, a Labour government will refocus Britain's influence towards cooperation and peaceful settlements and social justice. The life chances, security and prosperity of our citizens are dependent on a stable international environment. We will strengthen our commitment to the United Nations, but are well aware of its shortcomings, particularly in the light of repeated abuses of the veto power in the UN Security Council. So we'll work with allies and partners from around the world to build support for the United Nations reform in order to make its institutions more effective and more responsive. And as a permanent member of the Security Council, we'll provide a lead by respecting the authority of international law. To lead this work, Labour has created a Minister for Peace who will work across the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We'll reclaim Britain's leading role in tackling climate change, working hard to preserve the Paris Agreement and deliver on international commitments to reduce carbon emissions. We'll re-examine the arms export licensing regulations to ensure that all British arms exports are consistent with our legal and our moral obligations. This means refusing to grant export licenses for arms where there's a clear risk they'll be used to commit serious violations of international humanitarian law. Weapons supplies to Saudi Arabia, when the evidence of grave breaches of humanitarian law in Yemen is overwhelming, must be halted immediately, as Emily has made very clear many times in Parliament. I see it as the next Labour government's task, my task, to make the case for Britain to advance a security and foreign policy with integrity and human rights at its core. So there's a clear choice at this election between continuing with a failed policy of continual and devastating interventions that have intensified conflicts and increased the terrorist threat, or being willing to step back, learn the lessons of the past, and find new ways to solve and prevent conflicts. Dwight Eisenhower said on another occasion, if people can develop weapons that are so terrifying as to make the thought of global war almost a sentence for suicide, you would think that man's intelligence would include also his ability to find a peaceful solution. And in the words of another American, Martin Luther King, the chain reaction of evil, hate, begetting hate, wars produce more wars, must be broken, or we should be plunged into the dark days of annihilation. I believe we can find those solutions. We can walk the hard yards to a better way to live together on this planet. A Labour government will give leadership in a new and constructive way, and that is the leadership we're ready to provide, both at home and abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. Before going to the floor, and first of all to our membership, I have the prerogative to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
So, first of all, when you're in the UN, and as a permanent member of the Security Council, to make things work, you need to have agreement with all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they are protecting others. So you need to do deals across the board, and often with countries with very poor human rights records, in order to achieve what you want to achieve. So how does that square with a foreign policy that's based on human rights, that's based on an ethical approach? How do you manage to square the method and the end results?
You have to measure your policy against the human rights records that we want and the obligations that all 5 of the permanent members of the Security Council have signed up to through the Universal Declaration and through the International Criminal Court, which is not universal, but we wished it were, and the other conventions such as rights of the child, rights of women, and rights of environmental survival. I think you have to engage with all those countries on it. And indeed, there is evidence that where you do engage, things begin to change. And the engagement with China on environmental issues has changed Chinese attitudes quite a lot. And also, I suspect the high levels of pollution in Chinese cities has probably changed attitudes quite a lot. It is a question of being prepared to engage. It's not always lecturing people. It's learning from them as well. But it's also recognising that we can't go on as a planet, just presiding over this grotesque levels of inequality and accepting that there are tens of millions of displaced people and refugees trying to survive, often in the poorest countries in the world. The numbers who come to Europe by comparison to the rest of the world are actually quite small, but the disaster often affects the poorest in the poorest countries in the world. Think what it's like to be festering in a refugee camp in Libya or other places, just trying to survive. So the five permanent members of the Security Council do have a special responsibility in this, and you do have to engage with them. And so I would want to engage with Russia on human rights issues just as much as I would with China or any other country.
Thanks. And then, as you know, people have come to expect and welcome your letters from citizens to Prime Minister's questions. So we thought we'd take a leaf out of your book.
Okay.
And
which citizen has written to us?
So it's Pauletta from Cheltenham. Mm-hmm. And she's addressing something that you haven't talked about. And she said, "Dear Patricia, please could you ask Mr. Corbyn what he would do to increase cybersecurity in the UK? And at the same time, making sure that we keep our privacy online and are defended from attackers."
Cybersecurity is a very good question. It's actually probably the greatest threat that's faced all around the world at the present time, because cyber attacks can disable transport systems, disable communications, disable media, interfere apparently in elections in some countries. There's lots of things. I'm making no suggestions about anything in this country. It's okay. Put your pens down quickly. But it's a very good question, and it is a very serious one. And so you have to ensure that we've got the capability to deal with cyber attacks against our crucial infrastructure, our crucial infrastructure, which is, of course, telephone, mobile phones, and all the other things. But there is also the question of surveillance. And indeed, we have challenged the government on this over the question of the right of universal intrusion into people's emails, which I think is to be totally wrong. As a member of the Justice Select Committee, we had these discussions with the European Union during many delegations and visits we had there, and we did put forward appropriate amendments to recent legislation in the House so that we protect the privacy of the individual, but recognise that cyber attacks are real and extremely dangerous. Listen, we live in a very high-tech, complicated world where if you interfere with security systems surrounding power supplies or anything else, then you actually endanger life very, very quickly. You can kill people very quickly without firing any kind of gun or anything else. This is the challenge of our time, and I think it's time that we all faced up to it. Very good question. Thank you, Paulette.
Great, thank you. That's
Paulette. I'll catch you, Pauletta.
Of Cheltenham.
Of Cheltenham. I'll catch you.
I'm sure that address is significant.
Well, I wasn't going to make any reference to, but you have indelicately made one.
Okay, so I'm now going to our membership, and I'm looking for people at the back primarily who are young and of any gender they wish to be. So can I encourage people to... Yes, you get your turn, don't worry.
So you're looking for only young members get to ask a question, is that what you're saying?
Yes, not quite. I just want to start off the questioning perhaps with a voice from the future. So... Is there anyone? No? Xenia, I'm going to call on you as our first speaker.
Thank you very much. My name is Xenia Wickett. I run the US and the Americas program here at Chatham House. You've laid out a platform that is almost the antithesis of the platform that's been laid out by Donald Trump. You've expressed that there would be no intention of hand-holding the Americans or the American president. But you also have to recognize there are huge links between the United States and the United Kingdom. Economic links, intelligence links. How are you going to pass those two things? On the one hand, very publicly saying that I fundamentally disagree with many of the positions taken by this administration, but on the other hand, trying to ensure that there's the economic engagement, the investment engagement, the intelligence engagement continues.
Wait, I'm going to take two more questions before. So if I can go to this gentleman here in the white shirt in the sort of third row back. Wait for the microphone. And can you say who you are when you introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Hello. My name's Max Nicholson. I'm a postgraduate student at King's College. what future would the intelligence community in the UK have under a Labour government? And also, would you seek to make changes to the Investigatory Powers Act?
Thank you. And then the gentleman here behind you. Thanks.
Thank you. Sean Curtin, member of Chatham House. On the hand-holding point, you said no more hand-holding with Donald Trump, but I don't see that there's anything wrong with two men in this day and age holding hands in public. And listening to your speech, I think that actually there are many points that you and Trump have in common. You both described the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a catastrophe, and your commitment to the renewal of Trident and to spending at least 2% of GDP on defence will, I presume, get Trump to want to hold your hand. But my question is, the one area which you really seem to focus on in your speech was North Korea. And you seem to be very critical of Trump's approach. So I'd like you to just flesh out what is your approach to the North Korean problem. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for those questions. The approach to, on the first question, was it US and sorry, was it?
The US trade.
I can't read my own writing, that's the problem. Well, quite clearly, we have a very close relationship with the United States. We have a cultural relationship, we have a trade relationship, and we had, ever since the First World War, a military relationship with the United States. Does that mean that we always agree with every US president? No, not at all. The British government at the time, whilst politically supportive of the Americans in Vietnam, didn't commit British troops to it, and therefore one would suggest there was some degree of criticism implicit in that. Does it mean you can't have a relationship with them? No, I think it's the opposite. I think you have a relationship, and you might say it's critical, but it's also not just with the US president. I mean, there's day-to-day relationships with members of the House and members of the Senate, as well as all the other different communities across the USA. And so I have been in the USA many times, met huge numbers of people of diverse political opinions. You work with them all, but the relationship with the USA is an important one, and obviously something we would want to maintain. On the question about the Investigatory Powers Act and intelligence community, yes, we would obviously maintain GCHQ, and we would ensure that the powers of investigation into the citizen are backed up by a legal process. We would not give unaccountable power of investigation into somebody's life. And so if the authorities want to investigate the streams of emails, whatever else, they have to get a legal backing and able to do it. We don't want to create a surveillance society where there is untrammeled power of interference in the lives of the individual or of their privacy. Thanks for your point about hand-holding. Obviously, a Labour government would meet with President Trump and would have discussions with him. And you raised the point about North Korea. Well, I am very clear that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is important and must be made to work, but there are a number of nuclear-armed countries that don't have membership of the NPT, North Korea being one of them. The six-party talks were making a great deal of progress. The only way forward in the crisis over relations between the United States and Korea has to be a resumption of the six-party talks, has to be encouraging and thanking China for what it's done so far in trying to diffuse tensions, and also working with the South Korean government at the same time. Because the idea that one would countenance the bombing of the people of North Korea, or of North Korea sending missiles that would kill others, is absolutely appalling. So there has to be a developmental relationship. Now, the Obama administration seemed to be moving in the direction of building closer relations and trying to develop some sort of dialogue with North Korea. I think that is a wholly good idea, and we should encourage that, and that is what I would encourage that we do. One advantage Britain has is that we have a tradition of assuming diplomatic relations with countries that have an effective government. That means we do have relations, and I think it's important that we develop that principle.
Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions here, please.
Mr. Corbyn, John Pienaar, BBC News. What do you say to voters who support the British nuclear deterrent when you've made clear you would never order its use, either first or in retaliation? You have made that clear, haven't you? And what do you say to supporters of British military power when it's not clear in what circumstances you would ever order forces into battle, in or out of NATO, and including strikes against Islamic State?
And if I could then pass the piece to the Minister. Thank you.
Morning, Jeremy. Rachel Younger from ITV News. You say military action in some circumstances is necessary. You opposed it in both Kosovo and Sierra Leone. In retrospect, were those interventions the right thing to do? And in 4 weeks' time, you could be not just Prime Minister, but also de facto Commander-in-Chief. When you think about the enormity of the office, is that the part of the job that scares you most?
Thanks. And then last question from over here.
You mentioned the problem of the vetoes. How else would you seek legitimacy for action, and what's your attitude to responsibility to protect in a humanitarian crisis?
Thanks. John, the question about our security is obviously paramount. I've made that very clear. Emily's made that clear in her statements, as has Nia and others. Clearly, the importance is to protect people, all of our people, to make sure they're not under any kind of threat. Does that mean that there are ultimately some circumstances where you use military force? Yes, there are. And you think back to our history. Many in this room, well, nobody in this room was around at the time of the First World War, but I'm sure many would have questioned its legitimacy and its whole approach. I doubt many, if any, in this room would have questioned the legitimacy ultimately of the Second World War because of the catastrophe that had approached by the rise of the Nazis all across Europe at that point. And so I think there has to be ultimately that preparedness to use military force. Now, the question that was raised also, in continuing your theme, concerning, for example, Kosovo and Sierra Leone, the situation in Kosovo is not good. Could it have been dealt with in a different way, and could there have been a different approach? Yes, I believe there could. On Sierra Leone, there was actually quite wide agreement on the principles behind it, but there has to be a follow-up as well, and the follow-up has to be the kind of support and nation building you give at the end. And there have been places I've been to where there has been UN-backed military action in order to bring about or ensure a ceasefire and continue development of that country. I was, for example, a UN observer at the East Timor referendum, which had come at the end of an appalling civil war that had gone on for decades, with tens of thousands of people lost their lives, and that military UN intervention to enforce the ceasefire by and large worked. And I think you have to be aware that there are cases where you can do that, but it has to be done on a basis of law, and it has to be done through the United Nations. On the question of vetoes and responsibility to protect, I'm interested in the responsibility to protect issue and argument. Again, I think it has to be backed up by international law and backed up via the United Nations. I have also been in Rwanda and Burundi and the DRC, and the war in the DRC has claimed probably more lives than any other conflict that has happened since the Second World War. It has not had the attention of the world's media. It has not had the concentration of the world's media, and the killing has gone on. Rape has become an instrument of war in the DRC, and indeed I've been in Goma meeting hundreds of women who were collective victims of rape, and it was the most traumatic and educative experience of my life just to talk to them. Could something have been done? Yes. Could we have done more to promote a ceasefire? Yes. Could we have done more to challenge blood diamonds, coltan, and all the other things that are brought out of DRC? Yes. Why didn't we? Many, many questions I ask, one of which is the economic interests of people that didn't want us to intervene because they were getting the wealth out of there. Could something have been done to intervene at the time of the genocide in Rwanda? Yes, I believe it could. And indeed, I've met people in both Rwanda and Burundi who feel very bitter to this day that more was not done. And again, there seems to be an assumption that a war in Africa is somehow or other different to something on the edges of Europe. And so I think we have to engage. We also have to engage positively afterwards, because if you think of nations that have come out of conflict, take Colombia, take El Salvador. Colombia, decades and decades of civil war. Eventually, by good action by neighbouring countries, ceasefire was produced and a peace process has developed. But if you don't stay the course afterwards, as happened in El Salvador, those that were formerly protagonists in a civil war then end up in criminal gangs, and you have a similar degree of killing and instability, this time for crime rather than the purposes of engagement in that civil war. So it is about engagement, but it's also about use of the UN and international law. My question mark is over unilateral action.
Sorry, I know that was a really long list of questions, Mr. Corbyn, but would you mind asking the second part of mine, which is whether being our de facto commander-in-chief would be the part of being Prime Minister that scares you most?
Not at all.
So just for those who couldn't hear because it wasn't on the microphone.
Sorry, the question was about whether I found that part of the job the most frightening. Not at all. I want to see a peaceful world. I've spent my life wanting to see a peaceful world. I've spent my life working for the human rights of all and ensuring that everybody has some chance in life. If you don't mind, one slight anecdote. I met a group of refugees in a refugee camp in Syria before the present conflict broke out. And these were people living in tents on the border of Iraq and Syria in appalling, appalling conditions. They deserved better. And I was talking to this 14-year-old girl and her family, one of whom had died because the tents had burnt down. I said, what do you want to achieve in your life? And this child, in a tent, in the middle of misery and everything else, she said, thank you for your question. I want to be a doctor. Wow. She had ambitions. You see those all over the world. And so the opportunity of leading a government that will help to promote international law, will address issues of global imbalance and insecurity, and will be realistic about terrorist threats, realistic about threats of cyber insecurity, is something I relish, because our task surely has to be to leave the world better and more peaceful for the next generation rather than more dangerous and more at war the next generation. You have to deal with the problems all over. You have to deal with them in an international, multilateral way.
Jeremy, you're very popular. Everyone wants to ask you a question, and John wants a... Is it a
clarification? John sees me almost every... John Pienaar sees me almost every day.
Mr. Corbyn.
And you're causing upsets with Sky now.
Mr. Corbyn.
John, you're starting trouble with your mates.
John, in that case, I'm going to go to...
Briefly, for the sake of clarification, if I may.
Can we get on, please?
For the sake of Mr. Corbyn, you mentioned the importance...
John, can we move on, please?
All right,
it's unfair on the rest of the audience.
There's a lady in the front, in the third row back in the red jacket. Always wear red if you want to be noticed.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
That seems to be a trick that works. My name is Dorothy Guerrero. I'm head of policy and advocacy from Global Justice Now. My questions are two, actually. One is on climate. Considering that the policy of President Trump seems to be bent on making it more difficult for the even minimum agreements in the Paris COP impossible, what will be your position on that? Second is on the South China Sea. Considering the golden age of relationship with China and the historical relationship with the US, what will be the difference in the UK policy on South China Sea?
I knew you'd ask good questions. At the back, please. Thank you.
Very much. Saad Al-Duri, I'm a researcher with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. You mentioned the need to have human rights at the heart of UK foreign policy, and you also mentioned the need to work towards and support a peaceful peace agreement in Syria. But we know that the Assad regime in Syria has systematically persecuted its population and conducted human rights abuses on a mass scale. So could I ask you to clarify your position on the future of an Assad regime in Syria?
Okay, and then the last question here from...
Mr. Corbyn, Jason Powell, Sky News. If you become Prime Minister next month, will you immediately withdraw the RAF from sorties in Syria and Iraq? And if it's better to talk rather than bomb, what would you say to ISIS?
Okay. First of all, on the point asked about climate change, I more than regret the language President Trump used during his election campaign about the global threats of climate change and environmental degradation around the world. And I did indeed attend the Paris conference on climate change for a short time myself, and we have to be totally realistic that unless we are to take even more serious action than we do now on emissions, on pollution, and on environmental degradation, then obviously lots of life on the planet is under threat. We already have conflicts and wars based on environmental disasters. We have to be prepared to do far more to sustain our natural world and our environment. The refugees from Darfur have got involved in the conflict, and in fact, they're basically environmental refugees, and there are many, many other examples around the world. And so we would adhere absolutely to it, and indeed, the last Labour government was very strong in supporting all the international conventions, both on pollution as well as on CO2 emissions and the effects of global warming. And so I would be very strong on those issues, and indeed have been involved in many campaigns on those for a very long time. We can't go on polluting our seas, because in the end we pollute ourselves if we carry on doing that. The issue about the South China Sea, yes, there are obviously problems with China's behaviour. There has to be pressure put on them. There has to be an agreement reached. You cannot just say, because it's China, you can't say anything to them. You have to do something about it. China wants to be part of the world community. We all want everybody to be part of the world community. Therefore, that means putting UN pressure on them over their activities in the South China Sea. On the question that was raised at the back about human rights as a central foreign policy, of course it is, and I absolutely agree with you. The Assad regime has committed the most appalling human rights abuses, as have other forces within the region. There has to be a political process. That political process must also involve Iran. Geneva I didn't work because Iran wasn't involved. Geneva II, or if it now to be Geneva III, must involve all the actors within the region, including Iran. And I find it more than regrettable that President Trump now seems to be trying to tear up the agreement that was that President Obama's government and others had so painstakingly negotiated with Iran, which also had with it the possibilities of improving human rights in Iran by a human rights negotiation process, and that's got to be, always got to be important. On what we'll do over RAF presence and sorties, we'll examine what they're doing straight away, examine what their presence is straight away, but above all, that fits in to the whole point I'm saying, that I would do everything I possibly could in order to reignite the peace process, to ensure that there is a Geneva III dealing with the conflict in Syria, and clearly isolating ISIS is very important. Their arms and their money don't come from nowhere. They are being supported by a lot of people who are pouring money and arms into them. And so those people that are being, whose lives are being destroyed by ISIS and its behavior, need to also be recognised that the people that in effect are killing them are those that are giving money, arms, and allowing them to sell oil, which funds the whole ISIS. There has to be a comprehensive political and economic approach to the conflict.
Would you look at introducing a new financial tracking approach then, in the way that the United States has
A much stronger financial tracking approach is very, very important, because if you don't do that, you don't know where the money's coming from, where it's going to, and the amounts of money floating around the world that have come from international drug dealers and others, not so much in Syria but in other parts of the world, again, there has to be financial tracking, and our approach to that would be we'd have a very rigorous financial tracking mechanism.
Would you talk to ISIS?
No. I've made that clear that no, I would want to bring about a political solution, which would be through the Geneva process.
There's a woman in the green shirt, please.
A woman in the green shirt. Hi.
Hello, thank you. Deborah Haynes from The Times. You talk about how you would support the Trident system. Does that mean that you as Prime Minister would back a like-for-like replacement of the 4 submarines?
Well,
and also, could I ask a second question?
Sorry, go on, yeah.
Which conflict that has had British troops deployed to since the end of the Second World War have you actually supported, please?
Okay, I'll go on now to the woman in the back there. Thank you.
I'm Margaret Owen of Peace in Kurdistan. Jeremy, you're a great friend of the Kurds, and they're grateful to you. What will be the Labour government's policy towards Turkey? Will it condemn the genocide that is going on against the Kurds in Syria and in Turkey? Will it do anything to renew the peace process, ensure the Kurds are represented at the Geneva thing? And will you actually review the arms sales and actually review arms sales to countries which violate human rights? Will you condemn that Turkey for this? Thank you.
And then a gentleman over here on the left, please.
Thank you. My name is Euripides. I'm High Commissioner of Cyprus. Thank you for the tour d'horizon. A few words on Brexit, please, in relation to defense and foreign policy. Thank you.
And then in the white shirt. Is it white? Can't see. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Corbyn. I delivered a letter on Wednesday to the Prime Minister. I'm a former Royal Marine, and we are concerned about the cuts to defence since 2010. Freedom isn't free, and I know there's been conflicts that we've gone into that haven't necessarily been successful in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the security of our liberal democracy depends on a strong defence. Will you therefore guarantee you will fully fund the Defence SDSR 2015, and you will increase defence spending from the cuts that have happened from 2010 and undermined our ability to preserve our freedom in the future?
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. On deployment of British troops, yes, there are deployments, largely through the United Nations, that I think are the right thing to do. I mentioned what went on in East Timor. There's been great help done in peacekeeping in Cyprus by British forces. There's also been, I think, incredible work done by Royal Marines and others in helping refugees to survive who've been at risk in the Mediterranean. And indeed, talking to people in the Royal Navy about this, some of them said to me it was the most amazing work they'd ever done in their lives, which was actually supporting and protecting life. On the question that Margaret raised about Kurdistan, the Kurdish people were denied their identity by the conclusion of the Treaty of Versailles, and they're still living with the consequences of that. An independent Kurdistan was originally recognised in the Woodrow Wilson 14 points and then obliterated a few years later, and there's that thirst for that identity of the Kurdish people. Indeed, there are many Kurdish people in my constituency, and I've visited at various times in my life all parts of Kurdistan, and have witnessed the way in which Kurdish people have been very, very badly treated, and that indeed has then provoked the backlash of war there. And I would be very strong with the Turkish government on its treatment of Kurdish people and minorities, and the way in which it's denied them their decency and human rights, and use all the legal powers we have on that. And also, if arms are being used to oppress people internally in violation of international law, then they should simply not be supplied to them. And any settlement in Syria and the Middle East must include recognition of the rights and needs of Kurdish people, Armenians, and others. Because if you suppress somebody's identity, which is what's happened with the Kurdish people, then you actually end up with the danger of a much greater conflict later on. It is a question about recognizing people's language and their identity, which is, I think, an important part towards peace. The point our friend raised from the Cyprus High Commission, nice to see you here. 2 points I make. First, that I support reunification of Cyprus and the talks to bring that about, and Britain has a special role in this because it's a guarantor of the 1960 independence of Cyprus, and you and I have discussed this on a number of occasions, and we would certainly be very, very active in bringing that about. Emily and I indeed have discussed that with you. On foreign policy, on Brexit, yes, we will want to work with people. We will obviously still be members of the Council of Europe. We will obviously still be part of the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I see as a very, very important instrument of promoting peace and security all across Europe. And the point our friend raised from the Royal Marines, you probably noticed it in my own speech. I made a point about the way in which members of the armed forces have often had pay frozen. Those that are leaving the armed forces do not get, in my view, the support they need on leaving the armed forces, and too many of our former soldiers end up in a very, very difficult situation indeed. So I would look very quickly at the welfare issues surrounding our armed forces, but also your point about the funding of your group, the Royal Marines, and others, is a very important one, because actually it's that capability of defending is the most important, and I would recognise that and support that. When you said you delivered a letter, I thought you were going to say you delivered a letter to me, and I couldn't remember whether I'd seen it or not. Give me if I can have a copy, I'd be most grateful. Thank you.
Like for like.
Well, the decision of Parliament was to endorse the government's proposal for the replacement of Trident. That is the decision we will inherit as a Labour government, and that is what the position is. We will also undertake a strategic defence review, as all incoming governments do, looking at all aspects of our defence priorities for the future, but we cannot obviously decide what a review would decide, otherwise you wouldn't have a review.
Listen, I'm really sorry, but we have to end it here. And I know everyone's got far more questions, and I think that's a measure of the success of the event. I'd like to thank you, Jeremy, for making Chatham House the venue where you made your foreign policy and defence speech. Thank you for being so forthcoming. Thank you for answering as many questions as you possibly could.
Thank you very much.